Welcome! Marty G Sensations is happy to present A Taste of Life. Here, Alex Ray.
Yes.
Thank you, guys. Welcome back. So we just want to talk a little bit about where I come from. So my parents started the company Homegrown Hydroponics back in the 80s. It was 1985, and I was just a little sprout. I was just born. So I like to say that I was kind of born into this industry, and I'm quite comfortable with it.
Yeah.
You know, I've had to learn a lot about the medical aspects of cannabis because our company really comes from the medical side of things. We help people primarily learn how to grow cannabis at home under the medical system in Canada. So we have to know all about the regulations and the rules and things like that. But it's really interesting because we feel that cannabis is new to us. It's new in our society, but it's really not. Cannabis was probably one of the first agricultural products. It would have been before wheat, before potatoes or anything. People were growing cannabis, and mostly as food because the seeds are very nutritious, and there's fiber in the stalk. So people used to make clothes out of it. And we're talking, nobody really knows how long ago, but probably 12,000 years ago, people were moving us around. And so this plant exists all over the world. And it's not new. People have been interacting with it for a long time. So
Isn't it true that they make also paper with it?
yeah, you can make anything. You can make paper. You can make plastic. The hemp plant is the same plant as marijuana. They're not really different except for what they make. Marijuana is good at making THC, and hemp is usually good at either making seeds for oil or fibers in the hemp stalk. And so they are different, maybe varieties, but they're the same plant, marijuana and hemp.
But your parents started this. How did they have the intuition or the awareness to start something 30 years ago that has blossomed? You were in a little building at one point. You're in a huge warehouse now. How did this grow?
It's a great story. They were living out west in Surrey, BC, kind of as hippies. They were out on a farm. They were living with their friends. And they had moved from Ontario out there, and they got introduced to this idea of growing plants inside hydroponically. So it was kind of a primarily West Coast thing. It was underground to figure out how to grow cannabis
because it was
inside.
illegal too, right?
And it was illegal, right? I mean, it's this whole history of how cannabis becomes legal, but the industry is primarily based off of these hydroponics shops, these little shops all over the place. And, they were really illegal in the U.S. Because of their sort of perceived tie to cannabis. But in Canada, they were allowed to get established and get going. So they came from Surrey, BC. They moved back with the family and figure, okay, what are we going to do? They started a little retail business, primarily making all their own products and, selling lights for growing stuff inside, selling gardens. It wasn't primarily focused on cannabis, but the cannabis growing community really adopted these sort of products to be able to grow their stuff inside in controlled environments, away from prying eyes. And this is probably one of the reasons why cannabis in the world nowadays is grown indoors, is because the technology, the strains, everything got its start on the indoor scene. So that's kind of how it got started. And from there, we've developed a whole wholesale business. So we've started retail stores all over Canada now. And helped other businesses get started and teach their local community, okay, this is how you can grow cannabis inside. But the interesting thing about it is Canada actually has its own constitutional allowance for using cannabis. In other places, that might not be the case. So there's a fellow named Terry Parker, and he got charged with growing pot. And he lived up in Northern Ontario, but he was an epileptic. And so he got his case taken all the way to the Supreme Court in Canada. And in Canada, we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And that charter is the the highest law of the land, and it says that if you are forced to choose between your freedom, your liberty, and your health, it's a false choice. Your health always has to come first. We can't put people in jail because they're making themselves better. That's right. And so he was able to prove in that court case at the Supreme Court that without cannabis, he would essentially die of epilepsy. And epilepsy is one of these ailments that is almost completely eradicated with the use of cannabis. And so there was kind of a public relations thing at the time. And he's got this sign, and it says, "I'd rather have a joint in front of me than a frontal lobotomy." Because his doctors were saying,
a big choice.
We can cure you, but we're going to have to give you a lobotomy. We're going to have to take out a chunk of your brain.
Destroy your brain,
And he said, you know what? I'm gonna choose to grow pot, and I'll use cannabis. And he, you know what? Sure enough, he got better. And from that, we have the entire sort of medical allowance for cannabis. And now it's kind of exploded, because the interesting thing about cannabis is it doesn't just help with one thing. It helps with many, many different things. And that's because of the way cannabis works with our body.
Why have we kept it hidden for so long? Why have we deprived people of the chance to use it? Why have we made it like, the guy with the dark glasses and the sun, the raincoat entering into a cannabis store?
There's an easy answer. It's not easy to hear, but it's basically the prohibition was started because industries didn't like competition from hemp. And Henry Enslinger came from the prohibition of alcohol. Once alcohol wasn't prohibited anymore, they needed something else to prohibit. And I mean, you had not powerful groups that were using cannabis. So Mexicans, African Americans in the U.S. This is why cannabis.
So they need an enemy.
We need an enemy.
We gotta fight someone.
So they were the ones that were using cannabis, and they said, well, there was this whole misinformation campaign that's very well documented. They were lies. Okay, it was a lie told to the public that cannabis would destroy our communities. And cannabis is not a cure-all. It's not it's not a miracle. It's just like anything else that we have to understand and we have to use properly. But basically, the prohibition got started because they needed an enemy, like you say. And so that's why we had 100 years of prohibition. But that prohibition started to get chipped away because there was no good reason for it. And it helps people. The way it helps people, the funny thing is that we didn't understand that there was this whole biological system in our body called the endocannabinoid system. It means cannabinoids from cannabis.
Cannabinoid?
Cannabinoid.
I can't even say it, let alone do it.
There's a lot of tongue twisters.
Yes.
And they're made by your body. Your body has its own hormonal system. It's a signaling system. And it uses these chemicals very similar to the chemicals that are in cannabis. We didn't understand that system existed until an Israeli named Raphael Mechoulam. He did research on cannabis. And it's an interesting story because, I mean, at the time cannabis is prohibited. Where is he going to be able to get the cannabis in order to research? Well, he had a friend at the police station, and he said, I want to do some research on cannabis because he was like basically in a graduate program at the university. And his friend said, you know what, come down to the cop station and I can give you something. So he goes down, he puts a brick of hash in his sport coat, and he gets on the bus and he goes back to the university. So he's basically smuggling this illegal hash
from the police station.
From the police station back to the university, and they start separating the molecules and figuring out, okay, one of the molecules, they have it here, they take it, and their eyes get red, they start giggling, and they're very hungry, and they're a bit stoned.
That's the THC.
And it was THC, and they're like, well, whatever this is what makes you, this is what gives you the high associated with cannabis. Yeah. And it was very interesting because nobody even knew that we had this system in our body called the endocannabinoid system. We have receptors, we have signals, hormonal signals in our body that are closely tied to the chemicals in cannabis.
It's like if our body is made to receive the enzyme of the cannabis, in the right way, you know, like and utilized in the right way.
That's the way. Well, the interesting thing about that system is it's all about balance in our bodies. It creates balance in our bodies. So it's things about blood pressure, appetite, memory.
All those things affect
many
metabolism helps with the metabolism.
Wow. Exactly.
Maybe I can lose weight like that. I don't know. Keep my metabolism active a little bit.
You keep your fingers crossed.
The cool thing is it's very hard to use too much. You can have too much cannabis. You can have too much water. You can have too much of almost anything. But the interesting thing is it's good at producing balance in the body. So it can make you hungry, but it probably won't make you too hungry.
You know what I was wondering? When prohibition ended with the alcohol and people went crazy, is that going to happen with marijuana, with cannabis? Are people going to start using more and going wild, or is it going to?
We're going to see people just running on the street naked.
That's a misconception,
is
honestly,
that a misconception?
because during Prohibition, because there was no regulation, people were being very harmed by alcohol. They were going crazy on alcohol. One of the sad things about alcohol prohibition is, in order to try and stop people from using alcohol, the industry that made ethanol for industrial purposes would spike it with poison. They would put methyl alcohol into it. And so people were dying from the poison they were putting into it.
Just to prove that it's bad for you.
That it was part of it. I don't know what the idea was, but a lot of people were killed by that process during Prohibition, and people were using too much alcohol. You could during Prohibition and after. There's proper ways to use these sort of products in our lives, and the way I feel is we need to know how to use them.
Yeah.
Right?
Except
We need
for
good
knowledge.
information.
Yeah.
We can't have fear mongering. We can't have lies. None of that helps. When you have a taboo thing, I mean, you look at places where cannabis is a little more liberalized. They use the youth use way less cannabis in somewhere like the Netherlands, where it's not really that taboo. Kids know, hey, if I'm stoned all the time, I'm not going to be a good student. So they know that, and they avoid cannabis. I feel that you really have to have good information before
More knowledge.
you can act properly. And the youth are the same. They need to be informed properly before they can make good choices.
You are so enlightening. It's amazing. I mean, it's so fascinating to hear you talk, because you bring it down to such a level where we can all understand it, and the points of view that you have. Like, I haven't thought of all these things before.
It's a passion for me. I've been around it for so long.
It.
For me, it's normalized. And because something's normalized doesn't mean it's going to be used more. The media, they would talk about a lot, or even politicians being scared of cannabis being normalized. Well, that's not a problem. It would be a problem if everybody was baked all the time and they couldn't function. But just because something's normal doesn't mean you're going to use it.
Yeah, it's true. Like, look at Marty. Marty is not normal. I'm still on the run.
Thanks a lot, Paisan. Hey, what do you mean? I'm as normal as you are.
Oh, I'm not normal either.
That was great, Alex.
Excellent.
Alex, thanks a lot.
Thank
Everything
you,
is
Alex.
incredible, man.
Cheers.